good afternoon, good evening. It's great to be able to connect with people all over the world through these. I'm excited to be introducing some really amazing speakers who will be talking about the messy world where data comes from and some thoughtful and insightful strategy on implementing responsible AI. And that question of before you build a system, before you build a model, you need to understand what are you trying to solve. So my name is Lauren Decker. I'm one of the data team co-leads with Cindy Garcia. And so we're in the data management foundational team as part of IARPIC, the Intra-Agency Arctic Research Policy Committee. And for those who might be a little less familiar, IARPIC is a collaboration of US federal agencies that are working together to advance the research in the Arctic region and ensure that policy decisions are based on the latest and most robust science. So within IARPIC, the data management team is promoting the concepts of FAIR and CARE data management principles. FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And CARE, which is actually sort of FAIR, is that like, let's all work together and open science. And that's really great until you get to this, contrasting idea. Let's make sure that everything that we're building is for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So I am a non-federal co-lead. So in my day job, I'm the Chief Science Officer at Polarctic, and we're an oceanographic and data science company that builds AI for the Arctic, which is why today's topic is so near and dear to my heart. And so today's webinar, Responsible AI, CARE, and Community-Based System Dynamics. I'm really excited to introduce these speakers, but also this topic is just so on point right now. The last couple of days, we've seen some Nobel Prizes go out to Hopfield and Hinton. Those were the founders, some of the fathers of AI. And they received the Nobel Prize in Physics for foundational discoveries and inventions that enabled machine learning with artificial neural networks. And then, so that's like a Nobel Prize for developing the ability to do AI. And then today, it was a Nobel in chemistry for leveraging AI. And that went to some guys that work at Google DeepMind for developing an AI model that predicts proteins in complex structures. So I'm super excited to be introducing today's speakers as I'm calling it, you guys, future Nobel laureates for the Peace Prize in AI ethics. And so no pressure, but Donald Martin and Peter Hovmand and Ihi Doni are all speaking today. And so we're going to hear from Donald Martin, who's leading the Google team Scouts, Societal Context for Understanding Tools and Solutions. And this is a research group that's designed to help researchers and policymakers make better understanding social and cultural and economic contexts for which they're operating. And Dr. Peter Hovmand and Ihi Doni. Peter is from the he is the Interim Director for the Center of Community Health Integration at Case Western Reserve University. And he literally wrote the book on community-based system dynamics. And this is a method that offers a structured way to engage communities in the research process, ensuring that the voices and knowledge of local and indigenous communities are not only heard, but central to the decision-making process. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end of this. And we will, as we are the data management team and really enjoy our crowdsourced documents, we also have a crowdsourced document that we can collaborate on. So without further ado, I would like to turn things over to Donald Martin, who will get us started. Donald, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauren, for that great introduction. Hello, everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you today. Lauren did a great job of introducing me and my team, so I don't have to do that. I'm going to dive right in. We are going to talk about today responsible AI, care, and community-based system dynamics, I'm going to kick us off by focusing on the combination of responsible AI, care, and something called societal context. And then I'm going to turn it over to Peter and Ihi, and they're going to delve into the community-based system dynamics aspect of this. So I'm going to do this in two parts. First, I'm going to try to just triangulate the relationship between responsible AI principles, the care principles, and this concept of societal context. And then I'm going to talk about this issue of abstracting away societal context when we develop AI systems that can undermine the principles that we want to live up to. And that'll set us up to talk about community-based system dynamics as a possible solution to that. So on triangulating, first I want to briefly introduce the Google ethical AI principles as a way to do this triangulation. These were introduced back in 2018, so a little over 6 years ago. There are actually 7 principles. There's a URL at the top if you want to look at them in detail. I'm just going to talk about the first 2. Those are the ones I think about the most. The first one is to be socially beneficial. And it specifically states that in order to do that, we're going to have to take into account a broad range of social and economic factors. And based on that, we'll proceed with our AI-based interventions when we believe that the overall likely benefits substantially exceed the foreseeable risks and downsides. And then we'll talk about how hard it can be to do that. The second RAI principle is to avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias. This is a really important one. And we'll realize that in order to do that, you also have to think about social and economic factors. But the key to this one is that we are committing to seeking to avoid unjust impacts on people, particularly those related to sensitive characteristics. So that just kind of sets the tone with respect to those principles that folks in the AI space are talking about when they want to be responsible and ethical. Now I'm going to give a quick overview of the care principles for Indigenous data governance. These were created in September 2019, about a year after the ethical AI principles. And I think there was a lot of activity going on with respect to this aspect of AI in those days where people were realizing that this AI thing is coming. There's a need for a lot of data. There was talk about open data. And so there was a really focus on like, what kind of principles do we need to make sure are in place as we do this work? And so I'm going to just read a quote from the paper that was produced that introduced these principles back in 2019. The care principles for Indigenous data governance, which consist of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. Lauren covered that in the beginning. Empower Indigenous peoples by shifting the focus from regulated consultation to value-based relationships that position data approaches within Indigenous cultures and knowledge systems to the benefit of Indigenous peoples. And so we have collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility. I'm going to hone in on the ethics principle just because I see that as the kind of a key way to kind of link together the responsible AI, ethical AI principles, and the care principles. The ethics principle basically says that we have to live up to this obligation to minimize risk and maximize community benefits. You can already see the relationship to the responsible AI principles throughout the research lifecycle, and also to strengthen Indigenous rights by addressing power and other imbalances. So let's try to see how these kind of relate to each other. The RI principles, for me at least, is pretty straightforward to see the intersections between being socially beneficial and avoiding or creating or reinforcing unfair biases. In order to be socially beneficial, you have to take into account a broad range of social and economic factors. Those social and economic factors include unjust biases and unfair biases that unjustly impact people. So there's definitely a relationship between those. And then if we pull in the ethics from care, we see this, again, this obligation to maximize community benefit. So this immediate relationship between that particular principle and being socially beneficial. And then when we talk about needing to address power and other imbalances, again, that also points to the need to think about social and economic factors, think about existing biases, making sure you don't amplify them. Now, doing that, I contend, requires us, being able to live up to these principles that require you to delve into social and economic factors, think about power imbalances, requires the AI decision makers, people making decisions on data and research, to have a deep understanding of societal context. That's where all of these come together if we want to live up to these principles. And when I say societal context, what I mean is the dynamic and complex collection of social, cultural, historical, political, and economic circumstances that surround people, places, and things. Those are all interrelated. There's a dynamic, complex relationship between them. Societal context includes the values and the norms and the institutions that people interact with and the cultures in which they live. And so when we think about AI systems and other technical interventions that depend on data, those interventions have to operate within this dynamically complex societal context. And I have this kind of simplified depiction of that, but you can see those interventions are receiving input from that societal context. And as those systems operate, they are impacting that same societal context. Their outputs directly impact and intersect with that societal context. So it's unavoidable that these systems are going to impact that societal context. So we have to be able to think deeply about it in order to make sure that we're not harming society, to make sure we're living up to those principles. But when we build AI systems, we tend to abstract away societal context. And I want to delve into that a little bit. There's a great paper that I would recommend anyone read if they're doing any sort of work on social technical systems, and AI systems are definitely social technical systems. Any sort of technical system that is going to intervene in society is social technical. This paper is called Fairness and Abstraction of Social Technical Systems, written by Andrew Seltz. And there's this key quote out of it that kind of really brings to light the main thing that we need to focus on. It states that bedrock concepts in computer science, which is the underlying kind of technical approach that underlies AI. These concepts such as abstraction render technical intervention ineffective, inaccurate, and sometimes dangerously misguided when they enter the societal context that surrounds decision-making systems. That's a type of AI system. So here's a case in point of a system being dangerously misguided because of lack of societal context understanding. This is an example of racial bias discovered in a medical algorithm widely used throughout the US healthcare system. The purpose of this algorithm was to identify patients with the most complex healthcare needs so they can be given access to special programs. The hope being that this will reduce the costs in the overall healthcare system and improve patient outcomes. But unfortunately, people who were not selected for the special programs by this algorithm suffer from nearly 50,000 more chronic diseases than the people who were selected, and the people who were not selected were disproportionately Black Americans. So this is why the algorithm was deemed to be racially biased. So what happened here? The folks who built this, who identified this problem, and this happened in 2019 as well, at the same time that these principles were being established, they had unprecedented access to every aspect of how this system was built and created. All the people, the processes they used, the data they used, the models they used, all the test results. And they concluded that the root cause of this failure was incomplete societal context understanding. And so let's go into detail about what that means. Again, the machine learning problem was to predict which patients would have the most complex healthcare needs so they can give them access to special programs. But the AI decision makers who built the system made a key assumption in the beginning. They assumed that if people had more complex healthcare needs, that would mean that they will spend more on healthcare. And they assumed this was true for all populations. And so they chose spending on healthcare as what they call the target variable for the algorithm. That's the variable that they wanted the algorithm to try to predict. So their assumption was that if we can predict who's going to spend more on healthcare in the future, those will be the same people who are going to have the most complex healthcare needs. And this is why the algorithm failed, because the folks who made this decision and this assumption, based on this assumption, abstracted away and didn't consider all the additional societal context that impacts how Black Americans participate in the US healthcare system. So they ignored the fact that underdiagnosis due to bias reduces how much Black Americans spend on healthcare, even when they have more complex healthcare needs. The same is true for lack of trust in the healthcare system, wealth and income disparities, and lack of access to affordable healthcare. All of those factors actually decrease how much Black Americans spend on healthcare, even when they have more complex healthcare needs. Taken together, those represent a subset of the healthcare system structural inequities that exist in the US healthcare system for Black Americans. And taken together, those factors actually increase how much complex healthcare needs there are in the Black American community, while simultaneously reducing how much they spend on healthcare. So the lack of this full societal context understanding led to a harmful choice and led to the failure of that algorithm. So the key is, how do we reduce this abstraction? So let's look at why it happens. So I'm going to walk really quickly through a typical AI product development lifecycle. It's driven by human decision-making all the way through the lifecycle. The purpose of the lifecycle is to produce a machine learning or AI model-based product. So ChatGPT is an example of a model-based product. The model that is based on is called GPT. To produce that, you have to train and evaluate the model. To train and evaluate it, you have to select and prepare some training data. You have to make some choices. And in order to make those choices, you have to actually figure out how you're going to transform your problem so you can actually apply machine learning and AI to it. That forces you to think about things like what my target variable is going to be. And in order to do that, well, you have to actually understand the problem that you're trying to solve with AI. And this whole life cycle is driven by observations and data that come from, guess what? Societal context, this amorphous concept. And machine learning practitioners have lots of words for this amorphous concept. They call it the real world, the environment, the data generating process, the hypothesis space, the problem domain. It's that thing over there. They also have ways that we kind of characterize it. It's messy and qualitative and complex and nonlinear and causal and dynamic and subjective and historical. You have to think about things that happened way in the past. And these are all things that these characteristics are characteristics that aren't really compatible with our statistical methods for building models. And so that leads us to abstract it away, to put up a boundary that leads to us just focusing on the data that's being produced, but not the context that generated the data. When we do that, it's easy to forget that once you've deployed that product in the world, the inputs are no longer going to come from the training data. They're going to come directly from that societal context. And the outputs aren't going to just end up in your lab. They're going to actually become interventions on that same societal context. This is just another version of that initial diagram that I showed. Additionally, when you intervene on that societal context, it's going to have an impact on the next round of observations and data that are going to fuel your development lifecycle. So lack of understanding of that societal context can lead to poor choices, particularly in the very beginning of the process, that can have serious downstream impacts, just like the ones that we talked about with that health algorithm. So in order to resolve this, one of the approaches is to try to make sure that AI decision makers have tools that can put community certified societal context knowledge at their fingertips, starting with this problem understanding phase, but also throughout the entire product development lifecycle. And so, as we said, societal context is dynamic and complex, has feedback loops, it's nonlinear. And so we've been looking at system dynamics, particularly community-based system dynamics, as a possible way to produce the kind of knowledge that's needed, but to make sure we do it in ways that are non-extractive and that are beneficial to communities. Can we do that is the big question. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Peter and Ihi, and they're going to talk more about community-based system dynamics.
Thank you for the good morning, good afternoon. So Ihi and I will talk a little bit about community-based system dynamics. I'll say a little bit about just the background and some of the key ideas through some examples, and then hand it off to Ihi, who can elaborate on part of one of the models we've been working on, directions he's been taking some of this work as well. So it's important, sort of before jumping in too far, community-based system dynamics comes out of a field of system dynamics for understanding systems and how they change. And there's actually a variety of approaches that people use to involve people in the process of building those models. Group model building, participatory system dynamics modeling, and then community-based system dynamics. And mainly just going to focus on community-based system dynamics, because this has the origin of community-based system dynamics really begins with work in the West End neighborhood. And you're seeing on the right a series of pictures from what those community sessions look like as well as work with Foundation for Ecological Security and Rittner School District in St. Louis. And that was over a period of time where those methods developed. The main emphasis of community-based system dynamics is that one's engaging communities, and the term communities is a broad sense. It can mean a village, like the work we're doing here in Andhra Pradesh in India with Foundation for Ecological Security, looking at water resources and how they're being managed. It could also include groups of researchers, organizations. So the work that Donald's doing, for example, within Google is creating a community practice around community-based system dynamics. In each of these communities, as they evolve, take ownership and direction of what CBSD is doing in their particular context. And the emphasis here is developing a common language and building capacity for understanding the endogenous sources of system behavior. So from a feedback perspective, the example here, what you're seeing in terms of this is the last workshop after about 2 weeks of doing some group model building with this particular community. And what's notable here is several different features. You see that Telugu they have Telugu and symbols, and then it's actually the community members at this point that are introducing the conventions, facilitating the conversations, talking about the implications, interpreting the diagram. The members of the research team, the Foundation for Ecological Security staff, the faculty students are observing at this point. This is a community-led conversation. So in my mind, that's the target. You want to sort of be building up that capability so that at the end of that, people are taking it in their own directions. The other point I want to sort of emphasize around community-based system dynamics, there's a tendency to think about it as a single workshop. So I have colleagues who do more conventional group model building, and they'll come and see a session and they'll have all sorts of critiques about where things are at. But what they're missing is that these are multiple projects, and that they accumulate that experience and knowledge and networks in a community context. So the best example, or one of my favorite examples for this, is some work that we were doing in St. Louis with high school students in a program called Changing Systems. So this was after Ferguson, and initially it was focused on racism, and then it became gun violence. And so they're choosing the topics. The high school students are coming back year after year. Some of them are graduating, they become program assistants. Some of the younger siblings who were in middle school start becoming in the program, and you start to get sort of this multi-generational effect happening as parents get involved and so forth. And over time, on the left here, you see a series of activities from hopes and fears and graphs over time and connection circles up to the use of simulation model. Initially, that's not the main focus, but by 2017, there's some that have like, we're kind of bored with just drawing diagrams. We know you can do some simulation. Let's see some of that. So if you take an interest in that, by 2019, when they're thinking about emotional support in schools and stress, they're constructing models, and then some of them really want to move forward, but all of them want to know how to do that, not because they want to be modelers, but just they want to understand what's going on with the numbers and so forth. And they're able to then advocate for changes based on how those things work. So this is over multiple projects, topics in a community context. And then some of this work, this is related to what E and I have been working on, and colleagues in New Zealand, sort of looking at really the importance of building up this language from the local ecological context. So E and I first met, I think, around 2015, and we had a series of conversations and visits, but then it reached a point where we said we need to go and spend some time understanding metaphors and some visits and so forth. And what you see here on the left is a workshop where some staff from one of the organizations very quickly picked up the concepts of building models, and we're doing things within a few days that basically took our graduate students here at Case Western maybe 2/3 of a semester to learn. But it was tied to understanding some of the conventions in terms of stocks and flows and accumulations, in terms of water resources and lakes and so forth. And that's really the trick, is finding those metaphors, that cultural knowledge, and then describing it. And often systems is not a new concept by any means. It's already there. And so it's just making that connection. And on the right, you see another example of this in a later workshop, looking at well-being. This was from 2019. And again, the concepts are evolving. And part of what happens in this type of workshop is also people say, well, how would we represent this idea? And the conventions change. They're not standard in terms of the field. Another example that sort of highlights this idea of the non-extractive nature. This is some work with Undivided Cleveland. This is an organization that EE came to visit in Cleveland, and then Undivided connected us and with us and wanted to get more involved in this work. So over several years, we've been focusing on workshops around lead and lead poisoning and intervention. So they have an intervention they're developing, and this is a diagram that came from a half-day workshop. There's a video here with a QR code. You can see if Tanis and Michael and then Ms. Robin Brown talking about the use of system dynamics in this context. The important piece here is the diagrams, the resources for interpreting the diagram within a community context. They sit with, in this case, Undivided and community members. So the ideal here is, and this has happened multiple times when these diagrams get and these models are landing, is a community member who's never participated, had no formal introduction, looks at the diagram and recognizes the story or parts of the story, makes that connection, then figures out the convention, and then can read the rest of the diagram. You don't need a formal training to read the diagram if you already know the story. So the interpretive resources sit within the community local context, and that's how this shared language gets built up. And in this case, the interpretive resources don't sit in the university. This is with Undivided and having control over presentation. The diagram itself shows this essentially a theory of change that Michael in particular over here talked about, this sort of ripple effect for how they're dealing with lead in water and impacting children. And then the last example I'll share and then hand it off to EE really goes back to this, an early model that looked at traditional ecological knowledge and climate change along biodiversity. And this was a relatively small model. It was something that was developed for NSF grant. I shared it with EE. And then each time we talked, he would mention how he was using the model, and that's opened up a whole new line of work. And I'll hand it off to EE to expand on that and share that story.
Morana tātou, kone taku mihi karanga ki a koutou. Ko hōrua, Peter, Donald, ngā kaihautu ki tēnei tēnā kōrua mo te tautoko me te whakapai o te aratiki ki tēnei. Morning everybody from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Donald, Peter, acknowledging, recognizing the work and support you've been throwing at us and at this work, and to the new faces I haven't seen here before. I acknowledge your people that have passed on in your mountains and your rivers. It was an interesting introduction to Peter when he was talking about some of the systems dynamics approaches and concepts, and that after a really short period of time, we realized we've been systems thinkers for millennia in New Zealand. How we started to track this backwards was that Māori, when they stand to speak, will introduce themselves as a mountain and a river. And sometimes they won't introduce what their name is. You'll have to figure that out by how they move and walk based on which mountain and water makes them move that way. So some of our elders can already tell you where someone's from by their color, by how tall they are, how much muscle they carry, and so on. So we've been systems thinkers for quite a while. I felt a bit bad saying that to Peter, but we've managed to get a bit of a working relationship on what that should look like. And we still have a lot to learn from Peter. With this particular diagram, and particularly around biodiversity, where this kicked off was I was working with our Māori Language Commission that develops 6,000 new words per year that aren't just English copies of a word. So instead of motoka for motor car, we're going back to the origin of the word to figure out why it would be called a waka instead. So in that space of talking with the Language Commission, I said, I want you to have a look at this diagram because it suggests that we may have to start investing in biodiversity to retain the traditional ecological knowledge that surrounds it, and then we might be able to move language. And instead, you guys are just putting out fires by producing more language programs that don't have a context for why we would learn them, which pushed us back into the space of considering what aspects of biodiversity are present still and which ones aren't. From a Māori perspective, we work on the idea of atua, which are environmental representatives, gods, for want of a better word. So we have gods of the ocean, of the forest, and so on. These represent bodies of knowledge, and where they're not present is where we have concerns about why they've gone away. So from the last probably 18 months worth of work, we've moved from 10 atua, or 10 gods, to 200, as we've started to bring these back into popular circulation. And this piece of work here that Peter kicked off, and then I climbed on and said was a great model for us to learn more from, has been getting a lot of traction here. It's also getting a lot of traction because of the recent interest in investing back into the environment through corporate, wanting to increase their carbon credits, and that they've realized that in the space of investing in forestry, particularly in Australia, where they invest in native trees, their return is bigger. And they've just discovered that when they align that with Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, their investment return is even bigger. Now, I don't think for a moment that they're interested in what Indigenous or environmental concepts look like particularly, but their return is much better. So they're throwing a lot of effort into trying to support that, which means that they're looking very closely at what biodiversity as another investment stream could look like. And so they're looking for biodiversity indexes, which they're building, but they have none that come from an Indigenous perspective, which, for those that are listening, is something that we're trying to work alongside, but need to probably partner with others to figure out a platform to deliver it on. Is that enough, Peter?
That's great. Thank you. I think we have time for questions.
Peter, while we're here, I can quickly tell them about what's happening with our data centers, if you like.
Yeah.
While they think up their questions, in case they're really hard questions, I'll get in early. We've just initiated a tribal process to get data centers built that are based on environmental input, output, or inclusion of that data into our centers based on what environmental signs say we should. We're related to data in that we see it if it's come from an environment or from people, that they're relatives to us. So it's not objective material. And so if we have data come into our centers and people request it, we then have to align it with an environmental sign that says that it's time to release it to them, which means that if it's innovative, creative, and new information, they haven't seen it, we have to align it with a tidal change that's incoming, which is usually how those animals, plants, and so on near the ocean are fed, which means that we can then release that information to them. If it's an evaluative or testing process, then we try to align that with an outgoing tide. If you're mountain-based in your tribe, then we change the requirements for that as well. Basically, we're looking for autonomy over our data, but also to provide data that is in the space of, or in an attempt to move away from being deficit-based, because most of the solutions that government are throwing at us are built around the access to data that's online at the moment, but none of it's particularly positive, which means that what's produced is skewed towards a solution that we don't want. So AI is a dangerous prospect for us at the moment, but we're trying to influence that.
I see Jonathan has raised his hand. Maybe he could jump on and ask a question.
Hi, everybody. Jonathan Blythe, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. I also sit on the Arctic Data Committee as the U.S. representative, and this is a very timely presentation. Thank you, data team, for putting this together. So what we're looking at is renewing a IASC data policy released in 2014 that really predated the CARE principles and some of these the advent of AI, broadly, the large language models and other things that are coming into the mainstream today. And so looking at the at the time, people had anticipated open data, reproducibility of science, and I think it really anticipated this indigenous data sovereignty push that we have with the CARE principles, but it didn't mention it in name because CARE wasn't invented yet. So I just was thinking in trying to update this data policy, how we should incorporate how we can protect while also supporting the move towards open science, to protect the interpretation, analysis, use of those data so they promote beneficial outcomes to communities, instead of just letting it be a free-for-all and possible negative outcomes which may be exploited or used against those communities as evidence for decisions or policies that don't favor their interests. And I'm really interested in mechanisms we can use to do this. I have some other thoughts on down the line, but what are you guys bringing to the table as solutions for this? Do you have you had any thoughts on how to update these data policies for the future?
I can maybe start, and then if E and Donald they probably have thoughts on this too. I think with the causal maps that come out of CBSD, that they're people don't. I think I see a lot of this in public health. People sometimes think of these as sort of the full representation, like all the knowledge of a community. Like, now I know a community, but that's not how these exist. People choose what they want to share. These are strategic conversations, and not all the information is in the map by any means. So the interpretive resources reside with the community for being able to do that. So one implication of that is it is possible to have maps, for example, that describe sort of people having a series of causal maps that describe relationships. And I could imagine a situation where people are asking if they want to using data like open data analysis, they're being selective, or they're working within some structures of questions that have already been vetted, for example, using the causal maps. Now that doesn't prevent somebody from taking the causal map of a community and intentionally misusing it for some harm or exploitation, but it does restrict how that information is being shared, potentially.
Yeah, I have a thought on this too that kind of, I think, follows what Peter's saying. So we talk about data a lot, but as Ihi said, there are some mechanisms that led to that data, and oftentimes those mechanisms were, unfair, biased, had all these structural issues, and they led to the data, and that's why you have this kind of deficit. The data is reflecting deficits versus other aspects of the culture. So if I were going to try to have some kind of new policy associated with data, I would move towards insisting that having a data set without at least a hypothesis of the mechanism that generated that data would not be allowed, right? It would be like, if you're going to use a data set, you have to at least have a community informed hypothesis. And when I say hypothesis, I mean a dynamic hypothesis, which is like a causal loop diagram or Stockman flow model of what generated that data. So that is a way to kind of, and that's that forces you to start this kind of interpretation process, right? In the beginning, because what's happening is like, it's kind of like what's happening right now is, think of, sugarcane plant. That's the whole plant. What we're doing is we're distilling out of it only the pieces we want for refined sugar. We're leaving behind all that context, and it ends up being harmful. We need to be more holistic, which means upfront trying to, be thoughtful about what were the underlying mechanisms that generated the data, the indicators that we're going to be using to kind of drive our decision making. Not easy, but I think that's what needs to be required, something along those lines.
Great. Thank you for your thoughts on that. That's perfect.
It looked like you came off mute for a minute, if you'd like to chime in on that. And if anyone else has a question, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand or simply come off mute.
Yeah, no, I was talking to my mate that's over there making coffee, and he's grinding it and making a hell of a noise. So I was saying, hey, bro, shut up. But what I was talking about here was, or thinking about more specifically, was where these policies are discussed and built, having Indigenous nations present in the discussion is a key part. Also, what we've been finding, and I say this with as much respect as I can, some of the fellas that turn up with grey hair doesn't mean they know. Sometimes they embed colonized thinking further into our communities by being a mouthpiece on the behalf of white fellas, and we're not up for that anymore. So we're waiting for them to move on so that we can get to the heart of, or the essence of, why we would have thoughts, or more particularly looking at the metacognitive processes of thinking about how we think. And if those thoughts aren't from an origin that's ours, then they're questionable. So what I'm trying to say here is that those discussions with communities, just having community there sometimes isn't enough either, especially if they're not well educated in the context of what you're trying to discuss. So it's quite a difficult one to navigate, because the selection of those people will require some work with community for them to produce the one that they want to be able to move in that space. Sometimes it means assisting them to develop the capacity for someone that understands data better within their community, so that they do have a voice there. And over time, what we're looking for is people who are coming out of our communities to move from exposure to AI, to capacity building in AI, and then to the use of AI and systems in terms of dynamic capability of applying in places we never thought of as Indigenous nations, which is usually in a contemporary context of, while our ancestors may not have known about social media, we're starting to look at what are our traditional ancestral ways of knowing how social media is affecting the thought patterns of our young people and older people too, and getting to the essence of that so that we can reapply it. So there's a number of different things that you could consider in that space, Jonathan.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the discussion around language and, understanding of terminology. There is a growing practice in data science, roughly associated with the semantic web. And the idea, if I can summarize briefly, is that you could come up with like a canonical structure for how terminology is used that, could interoperate with different languages. This is especially popular in Europe, where they use their many languages there. So they've had to kind of overcome that challenge and have done through these semantic technologies. And at Google, there's this schema.org, which is kind of a refined or lightweight version of the semantic web that people are glomming onto, because you can tag your websites, your documents, your data with schema.org concepts and get it to be indexed by Google a lot more efficiently. But here, this is like an extreme example of where you're compressing the context into a very limited vocabulary, and it has unintended consequences, I'm afraid. So what are your guys' thoughts on all of this, and how does that interface with your community models, where it's really looking at the opposite of extreme and really elaborating on meanings?
I mean, I can try to start on this one. I mean, at a high level, I think that I think what you're saying, and I agree, is that while schema.org has some utility, kind of for certain things that you're trying to solve with respect to kind of indexing websites, having them rise to the top, those sorts of things, we're going to have to move to a direction where there's not one ontology, there are multiple ontologies that originate in multiple cultures, look very different, and when the participation in that is, of course, has to be voluntary. But we're going to have to learn how to deal with multiple ontologies as opposed to trying to distill things down to a ontology. Now, this doesn't negate the need for some sort of very high level, top level ontology that's very abstract, that will allow you to have a way to join and bring ontologies together for particular applications. But I think that's the direction where we're ultimately going to be moving. The key thing is kind of what is going to be the impetus, right, for moving in that direction. It all depends on like who's got some particular thing they're trying to solve, and are going to invest and build the capacity. But I see that as the sort of thing that will have to be done in order to address like the desire to have like culturally aware AI systems. You have to move away from distilling down to like a particular scheme or ontology to being able to digest the wide diversity of ontologies, in the right situations, in the right circumstances, in the right contexts, in order to have systems that work well for everybody in multiple contexts, in multiple cultural situations. Very difficult, but we have to go the opposite direction, I think, of something like schema.org in order to get there. That's my perspective. Not speaking on behalf of Google for that. That's my perspective. And the other thing to say, sorry, is that when you build these maps, those are a way for, in my mind, a way for a group or community to express their ontology of the world, right? And that's another thing that makes them powerful. And if there's any sort of lingua franca, I think it's just the notation for expressing context, cultural ontologies, using something possibly like the notation you get from system dynamics.
And just to add to that, what I often see happening in workshops, so the CBSD is explicitly built on an idea of language, that the meaning of a word comes from its use. And so you're putting these words into a diagram. It's a word sparse diagram. There's connections, and those connections help define the use. But what usually happens in a workshop is the meaning changes or evolves. Like people negotiate how they want to use a term and what that term means, and they find discrepancies. And the conventions that Don was referring to, like using pluses and minuses, becomes actually pretty important for realizing like that concept doesn't work that way. And then people will invent terms. So I think one of the things I run into, at least mostly with researchers, is sort of drawing on a theory of language about how language works that's inconsistent, at least with some of the work of linguistics from like George Lakoff and others who are thinking about metaphors. And this ties back to E's point about where language comes from. Comes from it has an ecological base. It has some origin in metaphors. Is how I would think about it.
I guess I'm going to jump in now and think about, I'm just thinking about how my kids have such a different language than I do. And so then if you're going to if you're building capacity in some of these communities, and sometimes you're talking to young people, and sometimes you're talking to a larger community group, do you see differences in the ontologies that young people make versus?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the most interesting, fun workshops are the ones that have like parents and teens. It's about parent-teen relationships. And there's a very safe way that you're able to sort of develop these diagrams. You're not talking about me specifically or you specifically, but you can talk and have conversations around that. Yeah, it does open up a way where there may be conflict around misunderstanding words. It opens up a way for people to have a different conversation.
So I also like that we actually talked about ontologies in one of the last meetings as well. So I'm enjoying that this is continuing the theme here, but I like that the definition of words is now actually based on what it's connected to in some of these system dynamics systems. Do you think there's a way to build that master ontology by looking at what's connected? Do you think I'm just wondering, it's so powerful to have different ontologies for different groups because they live in different places, because they do different things.
I don't think there's like an overarching like master that wouldn't make sense because for a variety of reasons. But I think what I do see initially CPSD was developed partly to this, there was a sort of an underlying hypothesis about the heterogeneity of social context. And if you wanted to understand that context, you needed some way to understand and elicit causal maps. And that wasn't going to be scalable by having consultants come in and do workshops. And that would be problematic because it would be extractive, even if you had the resources to do that. So the assumption, the initial hypothesis was that there was so much heterogeneity that implementation of any policy or program there'd be a lot of like housing or services that it would have all kinds of different effects. The stunning thing when we do this across context, like look at schooling or mental health, like Afghanistan, China, United States, the structure, there are these generic structures that appear when we're talking about basic human and social needs. And that's very, very interesting. So it's not like there's one diagram, but there is some underlying regularity, like, and it's completely fascinating to me that you have three environments like China, Afghanistan, and United States, and these are completely different environments, completely different cultures, completely different situations. And for example, stigma around mental health shows up in everyone as a concern of why family members are what they worry about with a family member who has a mental is living with a mental illness, right? So you see similar things on other topics as well. So to me, that actually is offers some idea of hope that these problems that are pervasive, they have a common structure. So suddenly now there's a need and there's a way to understand and learn across context, not just looking at a large population or a majority population, for example. That it's an interesting possibility.
Yeah, that's I really love thinking about how there are, while everyone lives in different places, experiences different things, has different language, you can find that commonality in just sort of what is being a person almost. So thank you very much for that. As we are approaching the end of the hour, if anybody else has any more questions, if anybody wants to check out the or contribute to the crowd sharing document, that'd be great. But I would like to say that there is a, let's see, an Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Care meeting that's going to be co-hosted with the Sea Ice and Permafrost meeting that the data team is going to be co-hosting. Anything else, Hazel? Did I miss that?
No, I think we're still figuring out the scheduling on that, but it'll be early November. So I think continuing a lot of the threads from this discussion, and Jonathan, it sounds relevant to the work that you and the Arctic Data Committee are doing. So that'll be an interesting one to stay tuned with. I think Angie Garcia, who's on the line, is going to be helping to present at that call. And yeah, so hope to see you all there. And I will just put a quick plug in the chat. Just a reminder that the recording for this call will be posted on the Arabic Collaborations website. And if you're not already a member, we would love to have you join there. So that's all for me. Thank you all so much. Thank you especially to the presenters. It was really interesting and thought-provoking.
Thanks again, Lauren, for inviting us, and Hazel for helping us get this going. Really enjoyed the whole conversation. I want to talk to you more about the ontologies conversation you guys are having. I'm really curious about what you all are talking about. So let me know offline if you get a chance.
Thank you.